It is 1776. In Philadelphia, revolutionaries are dipping their quills to sign a declaration that will sever a continent from an empire. But across the ocean, in a smoky London bookshop, a quiet, absent-minded Scotsman publishes a revolution of his own. 2 heavy volumes that will do more to shape the modern world than any army ever could. Tonight, we unravel the true story of Adam Smith. To many, he is the patron saint of capitalism, a caricature invoked by Wall Street bankers and free market zealots. But the real man was something far more complex and far more interesting. He was a shy, stammering professor who lived with his mother until she died. He was a moral philosopher who despised the greed of merchants and worried deeply about the poor. And he was the author of a phrase, the invisible hand, that the world has completely misunderstood for 200 years. In tonight's episode, we'll strip away the myths to find the human being beneath. We'll explore his deep, scandalous friendship with the atheist David Hume and his awkward adventures in the salons of Paris. We'll also take the time to understand the books themselves, unpacking his economic theories in the context of the world he actually lived in. And finally, we'll see how his legacy was hijacked by men who never truly understood him, all to further their own selfish ideologies. Before we begin, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It really helps us fight against algorithmic censorship. And let us know in the comments which topics you'd like us to explore next. Now, settle in as we journey back to the smoke and salt air of the Scottish Enlightenment to meet the absent-minded professor who accidentally invented the modern economy. This is the bedtime biography of Adam Smith. Chapter 1. The Boy from the Langtoon. On June 5th, 1723, a clerk in the presbytery of Kirkcaldy, Scotland, dipped his quill and scratched a name into the parish records, Adam Smith. The infant had arrived into a world that had already taken something from him. His father, also named Adam, a lawyer and comptroller of customs, had died in January. The baby would never know him. In the language of the time, this made young Adam a posthumous child, and that fact would shape everything that followed. His mother, Margaret Douglas, was left alone with a sickly infant in a small port town on the edge of the Firth of Forth. She came from landholding stock, respectable but not grand, which placed the family squarely in what her son would later call the middling rank of society. Margaret poured herself entirely into the boy's care. He was prone to nervous fits, delicate in constitution, and seemed to exist slightly apart from the world even as a child. She became his anchor. He would live with her, on and off, until she died in her 90s. There is one story from his toddler years that the biographers love to tell. At age 3, while visiting an uncle in Strathondray, the boy was snatched by a passing band of vagrants. Tinkers, they were called. A search party chased them down in Leslie Wood and recovered him unharmed. Someone later remarked that he would have made a poor gypsy, given his clumsiness and tendency to drift off into thought. It was probably true. Kirkcaldy itself was not a place you would expect to produce a revolution in thought. It was known locally as the Langtoon because its entire layout consisted of a single street, nearly a mile long, running parallel to the water. 1,500 people lived there, packed into that narrow corridor where all of life happened in plain view. Ships came and went from the harbour. Tobacco arrived from Glasgow, timber from the Baltic. Fish and linen and nails moved through the market stalls. For a boy inclined to watch and wonder, it was an education in how the world actually worked. The sound that defined his childhood was the din of hammers. Kirkcaldy had naileries, workshops where boys with minimal training could turn out thousands of nails in a single day. Smith watched them. He saw how breaking a task into smaller pieces allowed untrained hands to produce at astonishing speed. Years later, when he sat down to write about the division of labor, he reached for the example of a pin factory. The seed of that idea had been planted here, in the noise and smoke of his hometown. His father's profession left its mark as well. The house was filled with legal papers, customs documents, the bureaucratic residue of a man who had spent his career navigating tariffs and trade restrictions. The friction between free exchange and state control was not an abstraction for the young Smith. It was the paperwork on the desk. It was the conversation at dinner. It was the world his dead father had left behind. Sorry for the interruption. This is Charles from History After Dark, a channel that is entirely viewer-funded. I cannot produce these deep-dive documentaries without your direct support. A pledge of just a few dollars a month via Patreon or as a YouTube member provides the material base that keeps this channel alive. In return for your solidarity, you gain direct voting rights on future topics and a completely ad-free experience. Thank you. He attended the local Burgh School, one of the better ones in Scotland, where the curriculum ran heavy on Latin and the classics, Cicero, Livy, the Stoics. The Presbyterian educational philosophy held that a man's worth was measured by his service to the public good, and this idea seeped into him alongside the conjugations. He absorbed the Roman ideal of civic virtue without quite realizing it. His schoolfellows noticed something odd about him. He talked to himself. He smiled at things no one else could see. He would fall into trances in the middle of the schoolyard, lost in some interior world, while the other boys shouted and ran. These were early glimpses of the absent-minded professor he would become, the man who once walked 15 miles in his dressing gown, lost in thought, until church bells jolted him awake. The marketplace was a daily classroom. Unlike a child raised in an aristocratic manner, Smith saw the fishwives haggling, the linen weavers setting prices, the tangible back and forth of buying and selling. His later philosophy would never float entirely free of this grit. It was always rooted in the langtoon, in the noise and negotiation of people trying to make a living. His mother's drawing room offered a different kind of education. She maintained the social networks of the Douglas family, receiving guests, observing the rituals of Scottish hospitality. The boy learned the codes of propriety here, the unspoken rules that governed how people treated one another. This was morality as lived practice. It would eventually find its way into his first book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, where conscience emerges from the experience of being watched and watching in a social world. By 14, he had outgrown what Kirkcaldy could offer. He was sent west to the University of Glasgow, leaving his mother for the first time. The separation would always trouble him. He carried with him the accent of Fife, the mannerisms of a small-town boy, and a mind that had been quietly assembling itself in the shadow of hammers and harbour ships. The observer behind the window pane was about to step into a larger world. Chapter 2. Oxford, the Intellectual Desert. Before the desert, there was the garden. Smith arrived at Glasgow University in 1737, and it must have felt like stepping into a different country altogether. The Scottish Enlightenment was blooming here, urgent and alive, and at the centre of it stood Francis Hutcheson, professor of moral philosophy, a man Smith would later call never to be forgotten. Hutcheson did something radical. He lectured in English instead of Latin. He walked while he talked, pacing the room, gesturing, drawing his students into the argument rather than droning at them from a pulpit. Philosophy, he insisted, had to be useful. It had to touch actual human life. And humans themselves, naturally social, naturally good, these were dangerous ideas in certain circles, and Smith drank them in. But Glasgow wouldn't last. Smith was nominated for the Snell exhibition, a scholarship to Balliol College, Oxford. It was meant to train young Scotsmen for the episcopal priesthood. The money was good. The prestige was real. In 1740, Smith packed his things and made the long journey south on horseback. Crossing into England felt like entering another world. The roads were better, the farms more prosperous. Smith noticed everything, filing away observations about infrastructure and agriculture that would resurface decades later. But the further south he went, the more he sensed something else. A coldness towards Scots, a suspicion. Balliol College was a shock. The buildings were crumbling. The atmosphere was heavy with political reaction and intellectual rot. This was a Jacobite stronghold, politically backward and spiritually exhausted. Whatever energy Glasgow had possessed was utterly absent here. Smith later described Oxford as an intellectual desert. The professors had given up altogether even the pretense of teaching. He blamed the salary structure. They were paid from endowments whether they taught or not. Why bother? The incentives pointed nowhere useful. Smith watched this closely. He was learning something, even if no one was teaching him. The isolation cut deep. As a Scot, he was treated with suspicion and snobbery. His natural shyness made things worse. He developed what he called inveterate hypochondriasis and a violent scurvy that caused his teeth to shake. These weren't metaphors. His body was telling him something his mind already knew. He was profoundly unhappy. He refused to enter the priesthood. That had been the whole point of the scholarship, supposedly, but Smith wanted no part of it. This decision alienated him further from the college authorities. So he did the only thing left to him. He retreated into the Bodleian Library. 6 years. That's how long he spent there, more or less alone, reading everything he could find: Western literature, history, law, French philosophy. He turned his isolation into a massive self-directed education, broader than anything the professors could have offered, even if they'd tried. And somewhere in that silence, he found David Hume. Hume's A Treatise of Human Nature was considered dangerous, atheistic, corrosive to morals. When college authorities raided Smith's room and found his copy, they confiscated it immediately. The Reverend Inquisitors of Balliol reprimanded him severely. This was his first direct clash with intellectual censorship, his first real connection to the man who was already the bogeyman of orthodox thought. Reading Hume in secret changed something in Smith. Hume argued that you cannot derive aught from is. That reason is a slave to the passions. These ideas dismantled the religious certainty of Smith's upbringing. He struggled with them. He would spend years trying to find a way to save morality from Hume's devastating critique. The misery of Oxford forced him to become something. He translated French texts. He refined his English prose, purging it of Scotticisms, preparing himself to write for readers beyond Scotland's borders. He observed the corruption of the university as a kind of monopoly. The colleges had a monopoly on degrees, the professors had a monopoly on students, and so the quality of education collapsed. He would later apply this logic to trade guilds and chartered companies. He wrote letters home to his mother complaining about the laziness of the place, but he was careful. He didn't want to jeopardize his scholarship. He learned to navigate an institution he despised by keeping his head down, a pragmatic trait that would serve him well later when he became a bureaucrat enforcing the very tariffs he'd argued against. In 1746, the Jacobite rising swept through Britain. Bonny, Prince Charlie and his Highland army triggered a wave of anti-Scottish sentiment, and Oxford was no exception. Smith was a Whig, a supporter of the Hanoverian succession. He found himself increasingly unsafe in a college full of Tory sympathizers. He left abruptly in August 1746, never returned. He resigned his fellowship before it expired and went back to Kirkcaldy with no job, no degree, and no clear future. Just a mind sharpened by 6 years of defensive reading against the grain of his environment. 23 years old, unemployed, his head full of dangerous French literature and skepticism. He had rejected the path of the priest. He needed a patron. He needed a friend. He would find the former in a series of lectures in Edinburgh, but the latter, the great infidel himself, was waiting. Chapter 3. The Best Friend. Smith had been reading Hume in secret for years. Now, around 1749 or 1750, he finally met the man himself. The exact circumstances are lost to us, but the chemistry was instant. David Hume was already the most notorious intellectual in Scotland. Portly, gregarious, famously cheerful, and openly disdainful of religious dogma. He had published his Treatise of Human Nature a decade earlier, claiming it fell dead born from the press. This was only half true. The book had scandalized the pious, which made Hume a literary celebrity and a pariah in equal measure. The clergy blocked him from university positions. They feared his atheism would corrupt young minds. On paper, the two men made no sense together. Hume was 12 years older, worldly, confident, the kind of person who could hold a dinner party spellbound. Smith was the anxious introvert who talked to himself on long walks and fell into trances mid-conversation. Hume had a talent for controversy. Smith had a talent for disappearing into his own head. And yet, something clicked. They shared what historians have called a skeptical Whiggism, a commitment to commercial liberty, the rule of law, and scientific inquiry, all stripped of the religious superstition that had dominated the previous century. They were both moderates in the ongoing war against the high flyers of the Presbyterian Kirk. They both looked toward Paris rather than London for intellectual validation. They read Montesquieu and Voltaire, dreaming of a republic of letters that transcended borders. But it wasn't just ideas. There was genuine emotional intimacy. Despite the age gap, they treated each other as equals. Hume became the confident, worldly anchor that Smith had never had. He teased Smith out of his shell. He pestered him constantly to visit Edinburgh, joking about the barbarous nature of Smith's solitude. Smith, for his part, relied on Hume as his primary critic. He was terrified of publishing anything until Hume had seen it first. Their dynamic was one of intellectual commerce. Hume was the provocateur who tore down ancient systems. Smith was the architect who tried to rebuild them on secular grounds. Where Hume raised devastating questions about morality and knowledge, Smith sought answers. Much of what would become the theory of moral sentiments was Smith's attempt to solve the puzzle Hume had posed. How can we be good without God? He used Hume's own tools of psychology to do it. Hume introduced Smith to the Select Society, an elite debating club in Edinburgh. Here, the solitary scholar of Oxford became a central figure in the Scottish Enlightenment. He debated the nature of luxury, art, and history with the best minds of the day. He found his people. The friendship carried risks. In 1751, when Smith was appointed to the chair of logic at Glasgow University, he tried to help Hume secure a position there as well. The attempt failed spectacularly. A public outcry erupted against Hume's heresy, and the appointment was blocked. Smith learned early that associating with the great infidel carried a high reputational tax. A few years later, when the Church of Scotland threatened Hume with excommunication, Smith and his allies worked behind the scenes to shield him. They managed the politics of the Kirk to prevent a public trial that would have damaged the reputation of Scottish letters. The friendship was protective as well as intellectual. Under Hume's influence, Smith began to view religion differently. No longer a divine truth to be defended, but a sociological phenomenon, a product of human fear and wonder. This was a radical shift, and it would permeate everything he wrote afterward. The path toward the clergy, which his mother may have once hoped for, was now closed entirely. Smith's famous absent-mindedness became a running joke between them. Hume delighted in the stories. They were tales of a man so absorbed in thought that the physical world simply ceased to exist. Hume saw these eccentricities as proof of genius, evidence of a mind so absorbed in thought that the physical world simply ceased to exist. They were not just writing books. They were engaged in what Hume once called a war against stupidity and superstition. Hume took the brunt of the public attacks, acting as a lightning rod which allowed the more cautious Smith to publish his radical ideas under a veil of academic respectability. It was a partnership, though neither would have called it that. The friendship transformed Smith's ambition. He was no longer content to be a local lecturer giving talks on rhetoric. Fueled by Hume's example and encouragement, he began drafting the work that would make him famous. He wanted to rival Hume's reputation while correcting his philosophy. He wanted to explain why selfish creatures like us ever managed to care about each other at all. He was the infidel and the professor, the lightning rod and the careful architect. But they were also, quite simply, best friends. Chapter 4. The Absent-Minded Professor. In 1751, Adam Smith returned to the University of Glasgow. First he took up the chair of logic, then came the chair of moral philosophy. Years later, writing to the university principal, he would call this stretch of his life the happiest and most honourable period he had ever known. Glasgow itself became a kind of teacher. The city was nothing like Oxford, that stagnant pool of aristocratic dust. Here, commerce moved through the streets like weather. The so-called tobacco lords strutted past in scarlet cloaks, their fortunes built on Virginia leaf. Merchant ships crowded the Clyde. Warehouses hummed. Smith could walk from his lecture hall into a living laboratory of rising wealth, a place where money was not an abstraction discussed in Latin, but something you could smell in the salt air and hear in the clamour of the docks. He settled into a house in Professor's Court, reuniting with his mother and his cousin, Janet Douglas. The household ran with quiet efficiency. This suited him. He needed calm. When overworked, he fell into what he called his hypochondriasis, low spirits that would settle over him like fog. The domestic rhythm of the house kept those shadows at bay. His eccentricities, meanwhile, were becoming local legend. People noticed the way he walked, a strange, swaying motion that one contemporary described as vermicular, worm-like. He talked to himself openly on the street, oblivious to the glances of passers-by, his lips moving as he worked through some problem in his head. He smiled at invisible companions. He fell into trances. One story in particular made the rounds. Smith was giving a tour of a local tannery, explaining to a friend the benefits of the division of labor and the chemical processes involved. He was enthusiastic. He was gesturing. He was not watching where he was going. A narrow plank stretched over a tanning pit filled with nauseous fat and lime. He walked straight across it, still talking, and then he was in it. They had to fish him out. They had to strip his clothes off, the lofty mind and the clumsy body brought together in one humiliating splash. Another incident involved tea. He was brewing a pot for breakfast, lost in thought, and instead of tea leaves, he placed a piece of bread and butter into the teapot. He poured the boiling water. He tasted the result. He complained to his guests that it was the worst tea he had ever met with. And yet the university leaned on him heavily. He served as quaestor, managing the library funds. He was dean of faculty. Eventually he became vice-rector. The man who stumbled into tanning pits handled the accounts with precision. He negotiated with printers. He managed endowments. He was not merely a theorist of business, but someone who understood how institutions actually ran. His teaching style, at first, was awkward. Unlike his charismatic mentor Francis Hutcheson, Smith was no natural orator. There was a harshness in his voice. He stammered at the beginning of lectures, leaning his head against the wall, staring blankly until he found his rhythm. He admitted his reliance on student feedback. During one whole session, he said, "A certain student with a plain but expressive countenance was of great use to me. If he leaned forward to listen, all was right, and I knew that I had the ear of my class. But if he leaned back in an attitude of listlessness, I felt at once that all was wrong, and that I must change either the subject or the style of my address." This reliance on the plain student revealed something about how Smith thought about knowledge. He wanted to be understood by ordinary, intelligent people, not just the educated elite. That instinct forced him to strip away jargon, to speak clearly. It would serve him well when his books reached a wider world. The lectures themselves were revolutionary. He divided moral philosophy into 4 parts: natural theology, ethics, which would become the theory of moral sentiments, justice, tracing the history of law and government, and expediency, which contained the seeds of the wealth of nations. Over 13 years, he was drafting his life's work in a lecture hall. Students came from as far away as Russia and Switzerland. They carried his notes back to the continent. The Smithian style became a kind of brand before he had published anything substantial. Young men imitated his mannerisms, his distinct pronunciation of certain words. He was no recluse. In 1752, he helped found the Literary Society, where he debated with figures like Joseph Black, who discovered latent heat, and James Watt, who would improve the steam engine. This put Smith at the center of the intellectual engine room that powered the Industrial Revolution. He also joined the Anderston Club, a weekly dining society that met in a tavern to drink claret and eat chicken broth. Here, the absent-minded professor held court with merchants and scientists, absorbing the practical knowledge of trade that Oxford had denied him. During these years, his bond with David Hume deepened. They coordinated their careers across the distance between Glasgow and Edinburgh. Hume urged him to publish. Smith delayed, paralyzed by perfectionism and the fear of public scrutiny. In his lectures on justice, he began formulating a radical idea. The government's role was not to enforce religious morality, but to protect property and enforce contracts. He told his students that little else is requisite to carry a state to the highest degree of opulence from the lowest barbarism, but peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice. The seeds of laissez-faire planted decades before the wealth of nations appeared. By 1759, the pressure to publish had become unavoidable. His reputation was enormous, but his bibliography was empty. He decided to take the ethics portion of his lectures, polish them, and send the manuscript to London. He was stepping onto the world stage, but not as an economist, as a moral philosopher. And he was terrified of what the world might say. Chapter 5. The Theory of Moral Sentiments. In April of 1759, a slim volume appeared in the bookshops of London, priced at 6 shillings. Its author was a 35-year-old professor from Glasgow, and he was terrified. Smith had spent years preparing this book. He had lectured on its ideas to students who adored him. But now, with the thing actually sitting in windows for strangers to purchase and judge, the anxiety was almost unbearable. The book asked a question that had haunted philosophers for generations. If human beings are fundamentally selfish, as common sense and careful observation both suggest, then how on earth do we ever manage to be good? How does a creature built for self-preservation learn to care about anyone else? Smith's answer was elegant. He called it sympathy, though he meant something broader than mere pity. He meant the drive we all have to feel what others feel, to tune ourselves to their emotional frequency like instruments in an orchestra finding the same note. We watch a friend receive bad news and our stomach tightens. We see a child fall and wince before they even cry. This mirroring is not a choice. It happens whether we want it to or not. But Smith went further. He introduced a figure he called the impartial spectator, and this idea would become the heart of the entire book. The impartial spectator is an imaginary judge we carry inside ourselves. A stranger who watches our every action and evaluates it fairly without our biases or excuses. When we consider doing something shameful, this inner witness makes us hesitate. When we act well and no one notices, this witness still approves. Morality, for Smith, was not the voice of God thundering from above. It was the internalized voice of society, whispering from within. One passage in the book remains startling even now. Smith asks us to imagine hearing that the entire empire of China has been destroyed by an earthquake, millions dead, cities flattened, families obliterated. How would a decent European man respond? He would offer some melancholy reflections on the fragility of life, Smith writes. He might sigh at the news. And then, once all this fine philosophy was over, he would return to his business or his pleasure with the same ease as if nothing had happened. He would sleep soundly that night. Now, consider a different scenario. Suppose this same man learned he was going to lose his little finger tomorrow. He would not sleep tonight. The loss of one small digit would torment him more than the deaths of 100 million strangers he would never meet. This is brutal psychological honesty. Smith was not condemning humanity. He was describing it. We care more about our own pinky than about distant catastrophes, and pretending otherwise is foolish. But here is the crucial turn. Despite this selfishness, we do not actually behave like monsters. The impartial spectator reminds us that to the rest of the world, we are just one person among billions, no more important than anyone else. This awareness keeps our selfishness in check. The book landed like a small explosion in London literary circles, but the most memorable reaction came from David Hume, who could not resist tormenting his anxious friend. He sent Smith a letter that began with mock solemnity. "I proceed to tell you the melancholy news," Hume wrote. He then listed critics who had dismissed the book, stretched out the suspense as long as possible, and only at the very end revealed the truth. The mob of literati, Hume reported, are already very loud in its praises. 3 bishops had visited the bookseller just to ask questions about the mysterious author. This last detail carried a delicious irony. The bishops had embraced a book that barely mentioned God. Smith had explained morality through psychology, not theology. The religious establishment loved it anyway, apparently missing the subversion. Edmund Burke reviewed the book glowingly, calling it one of the most beautiful fabrics of moral theory. It became fashionable in London salons. Smith was suddenly famous beyond anything he had imagined. But fame is strange. In the very book that made him celebrated, Smith had warned about its dangers. He wrote about ambition as a kind of deception, a restless hunger for admiration that keeps us in continual motion, chasing wealth and status that cannot deliver the happiness we expect. He described a poor man's son, cursed by heaven with ambition, who spends his entire life pursuing trinkets and praise, only to discover in old age that he has traded real contentment for an illusion. Among the book's many admirers was Charles Townshend, a brilliant and erratic politician who would later help trigger the American Revolution with his infamous tax acts. Townshend read Smith's description of the man of perfect virtue and decided he wanted this philosopher to tutor his stepson, the young Duke of Buccleuch. The offer was extraordinary. £300 a year, guaranteed for life, plus the chance to travel Europe. It was more money than Smith could ever earn teaching. The deception of ambition that Smith had warned about in his pages now came knocking at his own door. In 1764, he packed his bags and resigned his beloved professorship at Glasgow. He was about to cross the English Channel, expecting intellectual adventure. What waited for him instead was boredom so profound it would force him to start writing a new book just to survive. Chapter 6. The Grand Tour and the Boredom of France. It was January of 1764 when Smith stood before his students for the last time. He had resigned his professorship at Glasgow, and now came the awkward business of money. He tried to return their fees for the semester, since he was leaving early. They refused. Some of them grabbed him by the coat, insisting his instruction had been worth far more than whatever they had paid. It was a strange scene, this stammering professor being physically prevented from giving back a few shillings, but it tells you something about the man. His new employer was the Duke of Buccleuch, an 18-year-old nobleman who needed polishing. The job was called a grand tour, that fashionable ritual where wealthy young men were dragged across Europe to learn manners and absorb culture. Smith was to be the guide. The irony was not lost on anyone. Here was an absent-minded academic who mumbled to himself and fell into tanning pits, tasked with teaching social graces to aristocracy. They landed first in Toulouse, in the south of France. Smith expected intellectual excitement. What he got was 18 months of crushing monotony. He spoke French badly, and the local society had little interest in a Scottish philosopher who could barely hold a dinner conversation. The glamour he had imagined dissolved into long afternoons with nothing to do. In a letter to Hume dated July 5, 1764, Smith confessed his desperation. The life he had led at Glasgow, he wrote, was pleasurable and dissipated compared to this. And then he added a sentence that would change the world. I have begun to write a book in order to pass away the time. That book was The Wealth of Nations. It was born not in some great library or lively coffeehouse, but in the tedium of a provincial French town where a homesick Scotsman had nothing better to do. Cut off from his friends and his books, Smith turned inward. He started drafting the arguments about capital and labor that had floated through his lectures for years. The skeleton of the book took shape in Toulouse, assembled from boredom and loneliness. Eventually, the tour moved on. In Geneva, Smith met his idol, Voltaire. He had kept a portrait of the French philosopher in his room at Glasgow. This was a pilgrimage. Voltaire, surprisingly, was charmed by the awkward professor. He later wrote that Smith was an excellent man with nothing of the pedant about him. The real intellectual climax came in Paris, where they arrived in late 1765. Smith was finally introduced to the physiocrats, a group of French economists led by François Quesnay, who served as physician to Madame de Pompadour. Their theory was simple and sweeping. All wealth, they believed, came from the land. Agriculture was the only truly productive activity. Manufacturing merely rearranged matter without adding anything new. Smith found this fascinating but wrong. He debated with Turgot, the future finance minister of France, about the nature of value. He studied Quesnay's famous tableau économique, a zigzag diagram that tried to model the economy like blood flowing through a body. The medical metaphor stuck with Smith. Economies needed circulation, not control. In the Parisian salons, Smith was something of a curiosity. The hostess, Madame Riccoboni, described him as the most absent-minded creature, speaking in a harsh voice, seemingly detached from the glittering conversation around him. And yet they embraced him anyway, for his heart and his reputation as the author of The Theory of Moral Sentiments. He also saw the dysfunction of the French state up close. The poverty of the peasantry was stark against the opulence of the court. Restrictions on the grain trade were starving people, while the nobles dined well. This was a case study in how bad policy could ruin a nation. Smith took notes. Then came tragedy. In October of 1766, the Duke's younger brother Hugh, who had joined them in Paris, fell violently ill with a fever. Smith watched the boy die despite the best efforts of French doctors. The death shattered the party. Smith's role shifted from tutor to grief counselor as the devastated Duke prepared to return home with his brother's body. They retreated across the Channel. The grand tour, which had begun with promises of enlightenment, ended with a coffin. Still, the trip had changed Smith's circumstances entirely. His pension was now secured for life. He would never need to work for a wage again. His notebooks bulged with the theories of the physiocrats and observations of French governance. He returned to London not as a provincial professor, but as a man who had debated Turgot and dined with Voltaire. His friends expected him to stay in the capital and enjoy his new fame. He did the opposite. Smith retreated north, past Edinburgh, all the way back to Kirkcaldy, back to his mother's house, back to the Langtoon where he had grown up watching the nail-makers and the linen weavers. He told Hume he needed solitary application. He thought he would finish the book in a few months. He was very wrong about that. Chapter 7. The Long Gestation. Smith returned to Kirkcaldy in May of 1767. He was 44 years old, carrying chests full of books and notes from France, and financially secure for the rest of his life thanks to his pension from the Duke of Buccleuch. The great work was waiting to be written. He had promised it. He moved back into his mother's house. The old rhythm returned. Margaret managing his meals, Janet managing the chaos, leaving Smith to work without interruption, which was precisely the problem. Days blurred into weeks. He barely left his study. His friends in Edinburgh grew alarmed. He wrote to Hume that June, describing his routine with a kind of defensive brightness. His business was study. His amusements were long, solitary walks by the seaside. He confessed he was becoming every day more and more Scottish. The cosmopolitan philosopher who had charmed the salons of Paris was retreating into himself. Hume was horrified. He was in London at the time, serving as Under-Secretary of State, surrounded by the noise and energy of the capital. He urged Smith to come to Edinburgh at least. Kirkcaldy, he warned, was a profane place. Solitude might be good for writing, but it was terrible for a man's spirit. Smith ignored him. He dove into a punishing schedule of reading, colonial data, grain prices, the economic history of Rome. The scope of what he was attempting began to crush him. He wasn't just describing the British economy. He was trying to explain the economic history of civilization itself. What he imagined would take a few months stretched into years. Then came the crash of 1772. The air bank collapsed. Douglas, Heron and Company had speculated wildly on land and credit, and when the bubble burst, it sent shockwaves through Scotland. Friends of Smith were bankrupted. Even the Duke of Buccleuch's vast estate was threatened. Smith wasn't merely watching from his study. He was pulled into mediations to save the local economy. He saw firsthand how speculators had abused paper money, creating a fiction that devastated real industry. Real frugality. Real livelihoods. The disaster forced him to rewrite entire sections on money and banking. He moved away from pure theory toward something more regulatory. Bankers, he now argued, must be restrained to prevent them from endangering the whole society. He compared them to builders of party walls who must follow fire codes. Freedom had limits when recklessness could burn down your neighbor's house. His health began to fail under the strain. Tremors, low spirits, hypochondria. In 1773, gripped by the fear that he might die before finishing, he named Hume as his literary executor. If the worst happened, Hume was to burn the unfinished papers. All of it. By that same year, Smith finally felt ready to leave Kirkcaldy. He travelled to London with a manuscript he believed was complete. But once there, new data confronted him. The American crisis was accelerating. He delayed publication again. 3 more years of frantic rewriting followed. He was elected to the Royal Society. He joined the Literary Club and dined with Joshua Reynolds, Samuel Johnson, Edward Gibbon. Yet even among such company, he remained the absent-minded professor. He sat silent at dinners, mumbling to himself, his mind locked somewhere in the arguments of his book. He spent hours in the British Museum, in coffee houses, gathering the specific statistics on corn prices and herring bounties that would give the wealth of nations its dense, empirical texture. His system of liberty would be built on undeniable facts, not just philosophical conjecture. The delay became a joke among his friends. Hume wrote in 1775 that he himself was brisk and healthy, while Smith remained slow and heavy. Would the book ever come out? The political landscape shifted beneath it. What had begun as a book about preventing a crisis became a book about surviving one. Smith realized the East India Company was a monster. He rewrote sections to attack it as a sovereign company that combined the worst negligence of a trader with the worst tyranny of a despot. A sharp political edge entered the manuscript that hadn't been there in Kirkcaldy. The final delay came with the outbreak of war in America in 1775. Smith decided he couldn't publish a book on empire without addressing the conflict. He wrote a daring proposal. Either grant Americans representation in an imperial parliament in exchange for taxes, or let them go entirely. Britain, he argued, must awaken from the golden dream of empire. The manuscript went to the printer William Strahan in early 1776. 12 years had passed since the idea first took shape in Toulouse. Smith was exhausted. His health was fragile. He waited for the verdict, unaware that his triumph would arrive alongside his greatest loss. On the 9th of March, 1776, 2 heavy quarto volumes appeared in London bookshops, an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. The price was nearly £2, a luxury item really, intended for legislators and statesmen rather than the general public. Smith was still in London when word arrived that the first edition had sold out within 6 months. Edward Gibbon praised it as the most profound treatise the world had ever seen. The clubs toasted him. The book was a success. But the very first reaction that truly mattered came from Scotland. On the 1st of April, David Hume put pen to paper. Huge bell. Dear Mr. Smith, I am much pleased with your performance. The Latin superlatives were Hume's way of crowning his friend's achievement. He had clearly read the book immediately and deeply. It has depth and solidity and acuteness, Hume wrote, and is so much illustrated by curious facts that it must at last take the public attention, though he did gently chide Smith for the density of it all, noting that the reading necessarily required so much attention that he doubted it would be popular at first. The letter also carried darker news. My health is very much broken, Hume confessed, describing a hemorrhage and a wasting condition that was slowly consuming him, likely bowel cancer. The roles of the two friends began to reverse in a way neither could have anticipated. Chapter 8. The Core Argument. So what did Smith actually write in those 2 heavy volumes? The answer might surprise you. The Wealth of Nations was, in Smith's own words, a very violent attack upon the whole commercial system of Great Britain. He wanted to tear down the monopolies and tariffs and guild restrictions that lined the pockets of the rich while squeezing the poor. This was demolition work. The book opens with something mundane, a callback to those naileries he watched as a boy in Kirkcaldy, a pin factory. Smith describes 10 men dividing up the 18 distinct operations of pin making. One draws the wire, another straightens it, a third cuts it, and so on. Working together, these 10 men can make 48,000 pins in a single day. One man working alone, doing every step himself, could barely make one. This is where Smith locates the source of wealth, productivity, the way labor is organized. But why do humans divide labor at all? Smith has an answer, and it comes with a joke. There is a propensity in human nature to truck, barter, and exchange one thing for another. We trade. We always have. Nobody, Smith observes dryly, ever saw a dog make a fair and deliberate exchange of one bone for another with another dog. We're the only animal that bargains. Here is where Smith breaks from the conventional wisdom of his age. The mercantilists believed wealth meant gold in the king's vault. Smith says nonsense. Wealth is the annual produce of the land and labor of the society. It's the food people eat, the clothes they wear, the houses they live in. Wealth is a flow, not a pile of shiny metal locked in a basement somewhere. And that famous phrase everyone associates with Smith, the invisible hand, it appears exactly once in all 900 pages. Once. And it's tucked away in a chapter about foreign trade, where Smith is explaining why merchants prefer to invest their capital close to home rather than abroad. By seeking their own security, they are led by an invisible hand to promote domestic industry. It was never meant as a universal law of markets. It was an observation about human psychology and the preference for familiar ground. Smith had no illusions about merchants. He distrusted them deeply. People of the same trade seldom meet together, he warned, even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public or in some contrivance to raise prices. Capitalists, in Smith's view, were a special interest group. The government needed to keep a watchful eye. His alternative was the system of natural liberty. Strip away the tariffs, the subsidies, the monopolies, the guild protections. Let trade flow. The sovereign would have only duties remaining: protecting society from invasion, maintaining courts and police, and building public works like roads, bridges, and schools. Smith was surprisingly progressive on wages. He argued that no society can surely be flourishing and happy, of which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable. High wages, he claimed, encouraged industry, and it was simple equity that those who fed and clothed the nation should themselves be tolerably fed and clothed. He also saw something dark in his own pin factory. In Book 5, Smith warns that the man who spends his life performing a few simple operations has no occasion to exert his understanding. He naturally loses, therefore, the habit of such exertion, and generally becomes as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become. Mental mutilation caused by the very efficiency Smith celebrated. His solution? Public education funded by the government to prevent this torpor of the mind. The British Empire came under direct attack. Smith called it a project that had cost a fortune and delivered loss and disappointment. He advised Britain to abandon its fantasy of American domination. Treat the colonists as free and independent trading partners instead. The book is massive and encyclopedic. Smith discusses the price of silver in Peru, the herring bounty in Scotland, the history of universities. He's building an argument from evidence, piling fact upon fact until the weight becomes undeniable. Every claim is grounded in what he calls the experience of all ages and nations. At its heart, Smith argues that the wealth of nations depends on two things: the skill of the labor force and the proportion of productive to unproductive labor. People are the engine. Their minds, their hands, their capacity to learn and improve. The gold in the vault means nothing if the people are poor. Chapter 9. The Death of the infidel. The year 1776 belongs to revolutions and declarations, to the birth of nations, and the publication of books that would reshape the world. But for Adam Smith, it belongs to something else entirely. It belongs to watching his best friend die. David Hume had been complaining of trouble in his bowels for months. The doctors called it a disorder, a stricture, though we would probably call it cancer today. Hume described his own decline with the detached curiosity of a man observing an interesting experiment. He noted the hemorrhages, the way his body seemed to be consuming itself from within. He wrote about losing weight with something approaching amusement, as though his physical form were simply becoming less relevant to the conversation. Smith could not manage such detachment. He fussed. He worried. He sent letters urging Hume to travel to Bath and take the mineral waters there, clinging to the hope that springs and fresh air might somehow arrest what everyone knew could not be arrested. The hypochondriac in Smith, the man who had always feared illness, now had to watch his fearless friend waste away with a smile on his face. Hume wrote back from his travels with the kind of joke that must have chilled Smith to the bone. "I am actively turning into pure spirit," he announced, noting that he had shed so much flesh he was practically detaching from the material world. This was Hume all over, facing extinction with a quip about metaphysics. A painful disagreement arose between them in those final months. Hume had written something dangerous, a manuscript called The Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. It systematically dismantled the argument that God's existence could be proven by the design of the natural world. Hume knew the book was dynamite. He wanted Smith to publish it after his death, reasoning that Smith's reputation for respectability might shield the text from immediate censorship. Smith refused. The request created a rare friction between them, a coldness that must have been agonizing given the circumstances. Smith argued that the scandal would overwhelm his own work, drag him into theological warfare he had spent decades avoiding. He valued his ability to influence policy. He valued quiet. Hume was disappointed, but handed the manuscript to his nephew instead. It was a revealing moment. Smith would launch what he himself called a very violent attack on the commercial system of the British Empire, but he would not touch the church. Their final meeting came on the 8th of August, 1776. The scene has a strange intimacy to it. Two aging men in a dim Edinburgh room, discussing the end of consciousness without any religious sentiment to soften the conversation. Hume had been reading Lucian's Dialogues of the Dead and had started amusing himself by imagining excuses he might offer to Charon, the ferryman who carries souls across the river Styx. He told Smith about the imaginary negotiations. "Good Charon," he would say, "I have been correcting my works for a new edition. Allow me a little time, that I may see how the public receives the alterations." And Charon would reply that there would be no end to such excuses. "Please step into the boat." Hume tried another approach in his fantasy. "Have a little patience, good Charon. I have been endeavoring to open the eyes of the public." The ferryman's answer was brutal in its bureaucratic finality. If he waited for that, he would have to wait till the Greek kalends, which meant never. Smith recorded this conversation with something like awe. Here was the philosophical life in its purest form, facing the terror of extinction with a joke about literary vanity while the body failed around you. Hume died on the 25th of August. The religious establishment watched and waited. 18th century dogma held that atheists must die in agony or madness, their final moments proving the necessity of faith. When Hume's doctor, the chemist Joseph Black, confirmed that he had passed in perfect composure, free from any spiritual distress, Smith made a decision. He would tell the world what he had witnessed. He wrote what became known as the Letter to Strahan, addressed to their mutual publisher but intended for public consumption. He described Hume's cheerfulness, his jokes with Sharon, his courage, and then he wrote a sentence that would cause him more trouble than anything else in his career. I have always considered him, both in his lifetime and since his death, as approaching as nearly to the idea of a perfectly wise and virtuous man as perhaps the nature of human frailty will permit. The word perfectly, applied to an avowed infidel, landed like a grenade. The backlash was immediate. Pamphlets appeared. Sermons denounced him. George Horne, the president of Magdalen College at Oxford, wrote a mocking open letter demanding to know how an atheist could possibly be virtuous. For the religious establishment, morality without God was a contradiction in terms. For Smith, morality was human and social. Kindness to friends mattered. Intellectual honesty mattered. Belief in the right deity did not. Smith later admitted to a friend that this short eulogy brought upon me 10 times more abuse than the very violent attack I had made upon the whole commercial system of Great Britain. In 1776, challenging how an empire made its money was safer than suggesting a skeptic could die well. And so Smith stood at the peak of his fame, utterly alone. The intellectual partner who had challenged him and teased him and loved him was gone. The correspondence that had sustained him for decades went silent. He was 53 years old. He had written the 2 greatest books of his age. The most productive years of his life were behind him. Chapter 10. The Bureaucrat. In 1778, something rather unexpected happened. The man who had spent years attacking tariffs and trade restrictions accepted a job enforcing them. Smith became Commissioner of Customs in Scotland. The salary was £600 a year. Combined with his pension from the Duke of Buccleuch, he was now earning close to £900 annually. For a man who had once scraped by on a professor's stipend, this was genuine wealth. He was, by any reasonable measure, one of the richest intellectuals in Britain. The irony was obvious to everyone, including Smith himself. Here was the author of The Wealth of Nations, the man who had called the mercantile system a collection of mean and malignant expedients, now sitting at the Royal Exchange in Edinburgh 4 days a week, adjudicating smuggling cases and inspecting customs accounts. But Smith took the work seriously. Unlike those lazy Oxford professors he had mocked decades earlier, he showed up. He pored over the minutiae of the revenue service with the same obsessive attention he had once given to pin factories and the price of silver. He recommended military force against tea smugglers. He believed a state needed money to function, even if the method of collection was economically foolish. One story captures his attitude perfectly. He discovered that some clothes in his own wardrobe had been imported illegally without the proper duties paid, so he burned them. He wrote to a friend that he had just bought a new set of ruffles and destroyed the old ones because he suspected they were smuggled. He would not break the laws he was paid to enforce. He moved into Panmure House, a substantial mansion off the Canongate. His mother, now in her 80s, presided over the household alongside Janet. It was a recreation of the domestic arrangement from Kirkcaldy, a petticoat government shielding him from the chaos outside. Panmure House became a kind of salon for the Scottish Enlightenment in its final years. Smith hosted Sunday suppers where remarkable people gathered around his table. Joseph Black, who had discovered latent heat. James Hutton, who had discovered deep time. James Watt, who had transformed the steam engine. The conversations ranged from chemistry to the American War to the nature of geological formations. But Smith himself often sat in distracted silence, smiling at invisible companions or moving his lips in some private debate. The hostess sometimes mistook his reverie for disapproval of the food. The absent-minded professor remained intact beneath the bureaucrat's uniform. He was once seen walking down the street holding his cane like a musket, completely oblivious to the staring crowds. He kept revising The Wealth of Nations. The 1784 edition contained new attacks on chartered companies like the East India Company, which he called nuisances in every respect. His insider knowledge of how government monopolies actually worked had sharpened his critique. Then, in 1784, his mother died. She was 90 years old. Smith was 61, and her loss devastated him. He wrote that he likely had only a few years left himself, and that he found himself very helpless without her. The emotional fragility behind the Stoic philosopher was suddenly visible. As his own health declined in the late 1780s, he became fixated on his unfinished manuscripts. 18 volumes sat in his study. A projected history of law and government, a history of literature. Work he considered imperfect, unfit for the public. In July of 1790, he summoned his executors to his bedside. Joseph Black and James Hutton came to Panmure House. Smith was agitated. He insisted they burn his papers immediately. He refused to die until he saw them destroyed. 16 volumes went into the fireplace. The executors watched the pages curl and blacken. For historians, it was a loss comparable to the burning of a library. For Smith, it was quality control. He would not leave behind anything that was not finished to his satisfaction. After the flames consumed the manuscripts, his agitation vanished. He received his friends for one last Sunday supper, but as the evening wore on, he realized he was too weak to continue. He rose from the table and spoke his final words to them. "I love your company, gentlemen, but I believe I must leave you to go to another world." He died days later, on July 17th. His estate was modest. Much of his income had been given away in secret charity over the years. He left instructions for a simple burial. His tombstone in the Canongate Kirkyard, just down the street from Panmure House, reads simply that here are deposited the remains of Adam Smith, author of The Theory of Moral Sentiments and The Wealth of Nations. The Edinburgh newspapers gave him only a few lines. His passing was noted with respect but little fanfare. And yet, across the Atlantic, in the new nation that had been born the same year as his book, a different kind of life was beginning for him. The founding fathers were reading his work. They were looking for a manual on how to build a country from scratch. Chapter 11. The Founder's Guidebook. The book crossed the Atlantic and found its way into the hands of men building a nation from scratch. They needed practical answers to practical questions. How do you fund a war? How do you manage debt? How do you keep 13 fractious states from tearing each other apart over tariffs? They turned to Smith the way a carpenter turns to a blueprint. Thomas Jefferson called The Wealth of Nations the best book extant on political economy. High praise from a man not given to flattery. But Jefferson read Smith through his own particular lens, finding in those pages exactly what he wanted to find. Smith had praised agriculture as productive, had criticized merchants as conniving, perfect. Jefferson latched onto these passages and used them to bolster his dream of a rural republic, virtuous farmers tilling virtuous soil. Alexander Hamilton took a different approach entirely. He wrestled with the whole thing, agreed with some of it, and then set aside the parts that didn't suit his purposes. His report on the bank drew heavily on Smith's analysis of credit and currency. The data was useful. The theory of free trade, however, posed a problem. Hamilton argued that a young nation couldn't compete with established powers like Britain without protecting its infant industries first. Let them grow strong behind tariff walls, then open the gates. This created something of a paradox. The architect of the American financial system used Smith's numbers to build the banking system, then tossed aside Smith's central doctrine to build the manufacturing base. The book was a toolbox to be rummaged through. You took what you needed and left the rest. James Madison found his own treasures buried in those pages. Smith had argued that having many small religious sects was better for social peace than one dominant church. Competition kept everyone honest. Madison took this logic and applied it to politics in Federalist No. 10. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The cure for faction was more factions. What's striking about this early American reception is what nobody talked about: the invisible hand. That phrase, which would later become the most quoted words Smith ever wrote, barely registered. The founders were too busy worrying about survival to construct market theology. They cared about taxation, public debt, whether to have a standing army or rely on militia. These were the chapters they underlined, the passages they debated late into the night over bad wine and worse coffee. Smith's critique of empire struck a particular chord. He had argued that the colonial relationship harmed both sides, that Britain should either grant the colonies full representation or let them go. The Americans saw in him a sympathetic observer who understood the folly of the mercantile system that had sparked their revolution in the first place. The book was read as a moral text, too. Early American educators taught the theory of moral sentiments alongside the wealth of nations, insisting that the system of natural liberty required virtuous citizens to function. The notion that self-interest alone could sustain a republic would have struck them as absurd. For the founders, liberty and virtue were woven from the same cloth. Pull one thread and the whole garment unravels. John Adams filled the margins of his books with angry notes defending Smith's view of natural aristocracy of talent and virtue, that is. These debates between Federalists and Republicans about hierarchy, about who deserved to lead, found ammunition in Smith's pages. Both sides claimed him. The first American edition rolled off the presses in Philadelphia in 1789, the same year the Constitution took effect. The publisher marketed it to statesmen and philosophical inquirers. It was a text for the elite, for the men who would shape the new republic. Political economy in those days was understood as a branch of moral philosophy. You read Smith to learn how to make the nation strong and secure. His warnings about workers ground down by repetitive labor, about the dangers of extreme inequality, were well known to these early readers. They saw education as the antidote. They understood him as a critic of the masters of mankind, those who wanted everything for themselves and nothing for anyone else. There was no contradiction for them between sympathy and self-interest, between his first book and his second. A free republic needed both the impartial spectator to regulate morals and the market to regulate prices. the two worked together. By the turn of the 19th century, Smith was firmly established in the American curriculum. He was the Newton of the moral sciences, a neutral authority whose data and arguments could be deployed by Jeffersonians attacking banks and Hamiltonians defending them alike. But neutrality never lasts. As the century ground on and the Industrial Revolution gathered force, something would shift. A new generation would stop reading the books and start reading the slogans instead. Chapter 12. The Weaponization. Something strange happens to Adam Smith in the 19th century. He stops being a person. He becomes a monument instead, one of those bronze figures in a public square that pigeons land on and politicians point to when they need to win an argument. The hesitant philosopher who fell into tanning pits and walked 15 miles in his dressing gown gets chiseled away, replaced by something harder and more useful. The transformation begins with the tariff. Before slavery tore the country apart, this was the issue that divided Americans most bitterly, and the wealth of nations got dragged right into the middle of it. Politicians stopped reading Smith as the founders had, as a guide to building a republic. They read him as a weapon instead, strip-mining the text for quotes they could hurl across the floor of Congress. The cotton-exporting South seized upon Smith's arguments for free trade with something close to religious fervor. They cast him as the prophet of their agrarian order, the champion of the planter class against greedy northern industrialists. Thomas Cooper, a radical intellectual who ran South Carolina College, became the high priest of this Southern Smith. He taught The Wealth of Nations as a political Bible, telling his students that the laws of free trade were as immutable as the laws of physics. This interpretation required a deliberate forgetting. Smith had called slavery economically inefficient and morally repugnant. The Southern defenders of their peculiar institution simply ignored this, performing a kind of intellectual gymnastics that separated the economic freedom of the master from the actual freedom of the slave. The North found itself in an awkward position. They respected Smith's authority but rejected his conclusions on trade. Henry Clay and the proponents of the American system argued that Smith's theories, while beautiful in the abstract, were inapplicable to the harsh realities of a developing nation that needed protection from British competition. Friedrich List, a German economist living in Pennsylvania, went further. He accused Smith of being a dreamer whose ideas would keep America forever an agricultural colony of Great Britain. The fight over who owned Adam Smith became a proxy war for the fight over the future of the Union. Both sides claimed to be the true heirs of the Enlightenment. The South claimed his liberty. The North claimed his vision of national development. The Civil War of the books preceded the actual Civil War. By the middle of the century, the theory of moral sentiments had largely vanished from the American curriculum. The impartial spectator, that crucial internal judge of right and wrong, got replaced by Homo economicus, a rational calculator of profit and loss. The sympathy that Smith had placed at the center of human experience was dismissed as irrelevant to the hard science of wealth. The centennial of the Wealth of Nations in 1876 marked the completion of this reduction. Grand dinners were held in New York and London. The speakers praised Smith for unleashing the age of capital, ignoring his deep suspicions of the very merchant class that was now toasting him. The Smith they honored resembled a Victorian banker more than an Enlightenment philosopher. The Gilded Age embraced a version of Smith that justified vast inequalities. William Graham Sumner, the social Darwinist, fused Smith's economics with Darwin's biology, creating a chilling worldview where liberty meant nothing more than the right to compete and fail. Smith's concern for the mental mutilation of the worker was forgotten, replaced by contempt for those who could not survive the market struggle. The word laissez-faire, which Smith never actually used in The Wealth of Nations, became permanently tattooed onto his legacy during this period. It became a shibboleth used to strike down child labor laws, safety regulations, and unionization. The ghost of the Kirkcaldy professor was invoked to defend practices he would have likely found abhorrent. A counter-current survived. Labor leaders occasionally tried to recapture Smith, pointing to his defense of high wages and his admission that masters are always and everywhere in a sort of tacit combination not to raise the wages of labor. They argued that the real Smith would have been on the picket line, but their voices were drowned out. By the end of the century, Smith had been hollowed out. He had become a bust on a library shelf, a name to be invoked to shut down debate rather than open it. The man of feeling who wept over poetry and lived with his mother had been completely erased by the apostle of greed, and the transformation was not finished. As the 20th century dawned, a group of brilliant economists in a cold, windy city would reinvent him once more. Chapter 13. The Chicago Smith. The University of Chicago, mid-20th century. A cluster of grey stone buildings on the south side, where the wind off Lake Michigan cuts through wool coats and the economics department hums with intellectual ambition. Here, in seminar rooms that smell of chalk dust and cold coffee, a counter-revolution is taking shape. George Stigler and Milton Friedman, two economists with sharp minds and sharper elbows, have decided to wage war on the Keynesian consensus that has dominated Western economic policy since the Depression. And they need a general, a dead one preferably, someone respectable, someone whose name carries weight. They choose Adam Smith. Or rather, they choose to build an Adam Smith of their own. Stigler, a Nobel laureate with a gift for sardonic prose, writes an essay declaring that Adam Smith is alive and well and living in Chicago. It is a bold claim, a funny one too. But it is also a kind of intellectual annexation, a laying of hands on a figure who has been dead for nearly 2 centuries. The Chicago School's great innovation is to take the idea of self-interest and stretch it until it covers everything. Smith had observed that bakers and butchers serve their customers well because doing so serves themselves, a reasonable point about market incentives. But Friedman and Stigler push further. They argue that self-interest explains marriage, crime, voting, racial discrimination. Every human choice becomes a calculation of costs and benefits. Economics swallows the other social sciences whole. Milton Friedman becomes the public face of this movement. He is small, bespectacled, quick with a comeback. He wears a navy blue necktie decorated with tiny cameo portraits of Adam Smith. And he wears it constantly, on television, at lectures, in photographs with world leaders. The necktie is a signal, a badge of belonging. Smith's face, reduced to an inch of woven silk, becomes a logo for the free market cause. 1976 arrives, and America celebrates its bicentennial. Fireworks, tall ships in the harbor, red and blue bunting draped across Main Street storefronts. But the Chicago economists have their own celebration in mind. The Wealth of Nations also turns 200 that year, and they seize the occasion to argue that Smith's book is the Economic Declaration of Independence, a twin to Jefferson's political one. Stigler delivers an address called Smith's Travels on the Ship of State, in which he suggests that Smith would have been a cynic about government, just like the Chicago boys. The invisible hand becomes famous during these years. Citations of the phrase skyrocket in academic journals and newspaper editorials. Remember, Smith used the term only once in The Wealth of Nations. Once. It was a passing metaphor about unintended consequences. But the Chicago school transforms it into something grander, a price mechanism that guides markets toward efficiency with an almost mystical intelligence. The invisible hand becomes a secular deity, worshipped by policymakers who believe markets can police themselves. This version of Smith requires some careful editing. The Theory of Moral Sentiments, his first and arguably favorite book, is quietly set aside. The impartial spectator, that imaginary figure we use to judge our own conduct, cannot be quantified. Sympathy does not fit neatly into equations. So the Chicago economists treat the moral philosophy as a youthful indiscretion, separate from the serious business of economics. Other inconvenient passages get the same treatment. Smith's warnings about merchants conspiring against the public, dismissed as inconsistency. His support for public education and progressive taxation, errors in judgment. His worry that repetitive factory work might cause mental mutilation in workers, best not to mention it. The Chicago Smith is a clean, streamlined figure. He has been stripped of his doubts, his contradictions, his humanity. Friedman's television series, Free to Choose, brings this version of Smith into millions of living rooms. In one episode, Friedman stands before Smith's grave in Edinburgh, grey stone and Scottish drizzle behind him, and explains that the invisible hand is what separates free societies from totalitarian ones. Smith is conscripted into the Cold War, transformed into a weapon against Soviet central planning. The political consequences arrive in the 1980s. Ronald Reagan in America, Margaret Thatcher in Britain, both carry the Chicago interpretation of Smith as their guidebook. Tax cuts, deregulation, the rolling back of the welfare state, all justified by appeal to the Scotsman who supposedly proved that markets work and governments do not. The Chicago Smith is everywhere. He is quoted in speeches, invoked in boardrooms, printed on commemorative stamps. Scholars occasionally object. They point out that Smith distrusted merchants, worried about inequality, believed in the cultivation of virtue. But these voices are quiet, drowned out by the roar of the bull market. The Chicago Smith is too useful to be corrected. He is an icon, a brand, a necktie pattern. Then comes 2008. The financial system, deregulated on the assumption that markets would discipline themselves, collapses. Banks fail. Governments scramble to prevent a second Great Depression. Alan Greenspan, who had governed the Federal Reserve according to Chicago principles, admits that there was a flaw in his worldview. The invisible hand, it turns out, had not been watching over Wall Street. In the aftermath, something interesting happens. People return to the bookshelf. They blow the dust off The Theory of Moral Sentiments, the one Friedman never wore on his necktie. They read about sympathy, about the impartial spectator, about the danger of admiring the rich simply because they are rich. They discover a different Smith, one who might have predicted that unchecked greed would end badly. Chapter 14. Conclusion. The Two Smiths. There is a weathered tombstone in the Canongate Kirkyard in Edinburgh. It sits flanked by the graves of friends, a humble resting place for a man who supposedly invented the modern world. Pilgrims have always come here, but the nature of the pilgrimage has changed in recent years. They arrive with different questions now. For over a century, German academics wrestled with something they called the Das Adam Smith problem, the alleged contradiction between the altruism of the theory of moral sentiments and the egoism of the wealth of nations. Scholars thought Smith had changed his mind somewhere along the way, or perhaps he was simply confused, writing two books that could not possibly belong to the same philosophy. There is no contradiction. Smith understood that humans are amphibious creatures. We are driven by self-interest in the marketplace and by sympathy in our homes and communities. A functioning society requires both forces, the invisible hand to generate wealth and the impartial spectator to cultivate justice. One without the other produces something monstrous. The boy from Kirkcaldy, who watched the nailmakers at their forges and then returned home to his mother, understood this intuitively. A human life cannot be reduced to a single equation. His famous absent-mindedness, the trances and the muttering, the 15-mile walks in his dressing gown, these were symptoms of a mind attempting to hold two massive, conflicting forces in balance. He was always trying to see the whole picture. Consider what he actually argued for. The gold in the king's treasury meant nothing to him. And then there was Hume. The great friendship with the infidel is the emotional heart of this entire story. It proves that Smith's philosophy was never an abstraction floating in the ether. It was grounded in human connection, in late-night conversations and teasing letters and shared grief. The bond between these two men demonstrated that intellectual honesty and shared values create stronger ties than religious dogma or profit motives ever could. Smith's fears carry a strange weight in our own time. He warned that if the division of labor was pushed too far without education to counterbalance it, the result would be a population suffering from what he called mental mutilation. Workers reduced to performing a single task, over and over, until their capacity for thought withered away. This was written in 1776. It reads differently now, in an age of gig work and automation, and screens that never stop glowing. In the theory of moral sentiments, he wrote that man naturally desires not only to be loved, but to be lovely. He meant that we want to deserve the praise we receive. This is the antidote to the greed is good culture that later generations would incorrectly attribute to him. True happiness, Smith believed, comes from the consciousness of being well-deserving, from knowing in your own heart that you have earned your place. The invisible hand, that phrase so often invoked, needs to be returned to its proper place. As we've seen, it appears only once in the wealth of nations. Once. It was never a god. It was a pattern, a tendency, something that operates only when surrounded by a framework of justice, rule of law, and fair play. Without the moral philosophy underneath it, the economic system becomes a jungle. Smith knew this. He said so repeatedly. Those 18 volumes he ordered, burned at Panmure House, likely contained his final thoughts on law, art, history. We will never know. We are left with fragments of his genius, which is perhaps why so many different versions of him have been projected onto the blank spaces he left behind. Everyone finds the Adam Smith they are looking for. Perhaps it is time to stop using him and start listening instead. He was never a weapon for the right or the left. He was a skeptical, curious, humane guide who asked us to look at the world as it actually is. Messy, imperfect, driven by passions we barely understand. And then, having seen it clearly, to try to make it a little more tolerable for everyone. The man within the breast, he called it, the conscience, the ultimate judge. He challenges us to be that spectator for our own time, to look at our economy and ask the question he would have asked. Is it efficient? Yes, but also, is it right? His epitaph in the Canongate Kirkyard lists both books, The Theory of Moral Sentiments and The Wealth of Nations. The stone itself demands that we read them together. Only then do we meet the real Adam Smith. The man who believed that no society can surely be flourishing and happy, of which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable,